still have a few people logging in, so we're going to give you a few seconds to get settled, and then we'll get underway. Just a few more seconds. All right, I think we're ready to go. We will still wait for more people to join. Hi, everybody. My name is Jo. Welcome to our in-session talk. We have over 200 guests registering for the event from 22 countries joining us today. Thank you for coming in. Today's subject is Open Innovation for London and Why It Matters. Before I introduce you to our esteemed speakers, Nick, Laura, and Theo, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording on our event page at some point later this week. Please use the chat button if you have any technical difficulties regarding the webinar. We also invite you to ask questions by using the Q&A button. You can upvote the questions if you like. Please, without further ado, join me in welcoming our speakers. I'm going to hand you over to Nick, who's going to start today's conversation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nick de Leon from the Royal College of Art. I have the privilege of chairing today's global in-session, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to a conversation on the topic of open innovation. First, let me introduce today's panelists. Laura Citron, CEO of London and Partners, and Theo Blackwell, Chief Digital Officer for London. Together, we're going to explore the topic and then invite you to pose your questions and to make your observations. Perhaps I could start by asking you both to tell us a little bit more about yourselves and your roles working for the city. Laura, do you want to start first?
Thanks very much, Nick. It's great to be here, and I'm particularly excited because I'm doing this event from our office near London Bridge in central London. Hence, I have this sort of Dr. Evil chair to sit in. So I'm Laura Citron. I'm Chief Executive of London and Partners. London and Partners is the trade, investment and promotion agency for London. Our mission is to create good growth in London, and that's economic growth that is sustainable and inclusive and innovation-led. And we do that by helping businesses to scale. So we support international businesses, mostly fast-growing tech businesses, to expand and scale into London, taking advantage of all the growth opportunities that London has to offer. And we support London-based startups and scale-ups to grow both within the city and internationally. So we support about 1,000 startups and scale-ups a year. And so for that reason, open innovation is really at the heart of a lot of what we do. So delighted to be here, and thank you, Nick, for bringing us together.
Great, thank you very much, Laura. Theo, let me turn to you. Tell us a little bit more about the Chief Digital Officer's role and what you do for the city.
Thanks, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. So I'm the Chief Digital Officer for London. I was appointed by our Mayor, Sadiq Khan, 3 years ago, September. Actually, 3 years ago this week, pretty much, as the first of this kind of post to lead on London-wide digital transformation, data, smart city initiatives and innovation at City Hall. So since then, we've developed the Smarter London roadmap and initiated a series of programs to build London's collective capability for innovation, including the establishment of the London Office of Technology and Innovation, which works with the majority of London's boroughs to scale great ideas and build momentum for further change. We've launched the Mayor's Civic Innovation Challenge, which I'll touch on later, which is our open innovation program. and we focused on fixing the plumbing as well through the Connected London programme, which is using TfL and public assets to create a full fibre spine across London in order to promote investment.
Oh, it's a lot of achievements, very fast indeed. Thanks very much indeed, Theo. Look, as way of introduction, I thought it'd be helpful for me to just make a few comments as an academic on the world of open innovation. We're living right now through an extraordinary moment in all of our lives, and it's unusual because it is a truly global experience where every human interaction is being reshaped into new forms. From education to the way we work, from socializing to the way we care for each other. You know, where in the past, innovation was like a luxury good, something to be indulged in when the corporate coffers were full, it's now a necessity for survival. Businesses, schools, universities, retailers, museums, doctors, surgeries, we've all compacted about a decade of innovation into just 25 weeks. Yes, it's only that since we locked down. It seems like a different world 25 weeks ago. But it means also innovating differently. Open innovation means recognizing that you don't have to originate an idea to profit from it. But being first to market is less important than being the first with the right business model. There are lots of smart people who aren't working for your organization, but who can contribute to your success. But others can build on your products and services better than you can, and that customers know more about their problems than you ever will. So if you want to offer them solutions, it might be smarter to co-create those solutions with them. Now, my own research has focused on what are the ingredients that make a city a hub of innovation. And I can go back into the history, and for the last 5 centuries, London has absolutely blazed a trail right from the beginning of the scientific revolution, and still does in the 21st century. You can even trace it back to Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII and that schism with Rome as being something that helped launch the Industrial Revolution. It does take a little bit of imagination in an academic to do that, I should add. But what I think is important, that there are the Mayor of London, London and Partners, and all of the activities are so focused to maintain London's leadership. And that will also mean through new programs. And we're going to introduce one of those new programs to you today, which is the Open Innovation Fellowship Program. But we'll tell you about that later. Now, before this, I was inspired by a quote that I read in February by Arundhati Roy. She wrote in the Financial Times, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudices, or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world." Well, I found those words myself incredibly inspiring, and really believe that open innovation with its very inclusive approach is really the right way. And if we can harness that in London, then we can make London and retain its leadership. Others may snap at our heels, but whilst they're only snapping, that's fine. So let me turn to some of the questions we're going to pose today and try and answer for you in our conversation. And I'm going to start with something quite fundamental that many of our listeners will have differing answers to. What do we actually mean by open innovation, and why is it important? So, Theo, could I kick off with that question to you? Open innovation, why is it so important? How do you see it?
Thanks, Nick. Well, I think it's more than just thinking outside of the box. I think it's about diversifying where ideas come from. And it's also a route through which design thinking and systems thinking can be put into place in structures in organizations that often haven't changed for a while as society has digitized and changed around them. So what we're looking here is really a route for change. It can promote growth. It can help people adopt new approaches. From our perspective as a city, it can engage the tech sector around us, not just the big tech companies, but the scale-ups that are often brimming with ideas. And a proper open innovation approach can also help us see the art of the possible, where in our silos we haven't been able to perceive it ourselves, and creates a process for us to bridge risk that we sometimes perceive when we engage with non-traditional suppliers. And if I could just sort of like reflect on, as it were, old structures that have barely changed in decades, that usually, you know, if you were set a project in an organization sometimes, and this doesn't just relate to the public sector, it relates to all organizations, you receive direction from above, you research the problem, you identify your crucial stakeholders, you probably look for existing solutions to match what those upstairs want, and then you assess the risk. You seek evidence to back up those solutions. You probably deploy numbers in order to back that up as well. And then you send through the process and you create policy. Now, that's a very glib way of saying how a traditional policy-making process would work. An open innovation focuses much more on deciding what your outcome is first, and through the process of challenge and design in iteration, agile approaches, you're able to refine your solution with the needs of your user at the center. And I think that necessitates a great deal of change in the way that organizations do things. And so our open innovation approach that we started introducing in 2018 was precisely to introduce those new ideas to problems that we found difficult to solve. So by setting each year a series, three open innovation challenges to London's SME community and tech sector, we've been able to do things like create an app for TfL called Go Jointly, or an app for citizens called Go Jointly, which enables, through the use of TfL data, which wouldn't otherwise be available to that app developer, new ways of walking around the city. We've been able to set a challenge around tackling online extremism from the police. And that MPS-led challenge enabled us to engage with universities around the use of AI for identifying extremist content online and take it down. And we've also been able to experiment with 3D planning models. Now, all of those things were things that if we'd done them ourselves, we probably wouldn't have had the capability. It probably would have been more expensive, and it would have taken time, and we were very quickly able to go to prototype.
So clearly the kind of the speed, the de-risking, the breadth of ideas you can engage with, the capacity to engage with communities you otherwise wouldn't reach, means you can also create solutions that can create more value because they're perhaps much more imaginative. So as you say, going far beyond just thinking outside of the box, but delivering also outside of the box too. Laura, what your perspective on this, about what is open innovation, why it's important, particularly in the context of London?
I think Theo has brilliantly articulated the benefits of open innovation to larger organisations. So let me say a few words about the other side, those with whom the innovation happens. So broadly, startups, scale-ups, innovators, entrepreneurs, universities. Open innovation is absolutely critical for small businesses to scale. Any B2B startup business, and most startup businesses are in fact business to business rather than business to consumer, can only grow by working in partnership with larger organisations who are their clients. And one of the reasons that London has a really vibrant and successful tech industry is because there are large organisations in London, both corporates but also big public sector buyers like those Theo's mentioned, Transport for London, the police, who have opened up their supply chains and their innovation processes to collaborate with those early stage companies, startups and scale-ups, to work together, because that is the fuel with which they can grow, winning ever bigger contracts and scaling into large organisations in their own right. So that's why it matters. Open innovation matters to the organisations that do it for all the reasons Theo has said, but it also matters enormously to the health of London's tech ecosystem and our culture of entrepreneurialism. And that matters because it's our competitive advantage. It's a huge part of what makes London globally competitive for international, innovation-driven, knowledge economy or tech or disruptive businesses that are looking to scale. Businesses want to come and scale into London because there is a density of corporates and large-scale organisations here. There are more European and global HQs in London than in any other European city. But that scale alone wouldn't be a competitive advantage if they were all closed shops and they were not open to innovation. It was closed shop, difficult procurement processes, and actually international scale-ups couldn't get through the door. So what's critical to London's competitive advantage is not only having a big density of large-scale global organisations who will be significant investors in open innovation, in innovation generally, but that they choose to do it in a way that is open and that's genuinely inclusive, where they're looking for the best ideas wherever they come from. And that's why we've launched the Open Innovation Fellowship, which I'm sure we'll come on to in more detail later, Nick, which is really about supporting London-based corporates and large public sector organisations to make their open innovation more effective, but also importantly more inclusive, because that plays to our competitive advantage. So hopefully between sort of Theo's view of why it matters to the organisations that do it, and also why it matters to the startup and tech community, and therefore to London's competitiveness, I think it's hopefully quite compelling as to why it's a topic that we're all here talking about today.
I mean, London is the most extraordinary microcosm, isn't it? I mean, you know, I think the statistic of over 38% of people who live in London were not born in the UK, I think is an amazing statistic that talks to the very cosmopolitan nature of one of the most international global cities in the world. And of course, for companies coming here and deciding to set up here, as you say, there are in a B2B sense, you've got the global headquarters of major corporations who are based here that are seeking to innovate. And as you say, we've got 1,000 companies that you're working with directly, and many more companies that I know you would want to work with indeed. So if we look at open innovation for London as a city, including for its citizens, how do we think that, and again, Theo, you commented earlier about all of this being very, very, centered around the user, the customer, and that's where it begins, with that combination of kind of design thinking and systems thinking meeting open innovation. Perhaps again, Laura, I could just start with you again, just to think about the broader sense of also involving the communities that live here and how they can be part of this. So why is open innovation important for London as a city as a whole?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll let Theo probably pick up better than I will on co-creation and user-centric design and those aspects. But let me look at it through a different lens, which is that we know that through this pandemic, the nature of work itself is going to fundamentally change. The nature of employment is going to fundamentally change. And the ability for people to be entrepreneurs, to have an idea, to start a business and to scale a business has probably never been more important than it is now. And what matters for London is that opportunity to be an entrepreneur and to scale a business is open to all Londoners. we've spoken about many of the great things about London, but London is also a city that has really significant structural inequalities, social and economic inequalities between different communities. It's really important that the opportunities offered by entrepreneurship are available to all of our communities. And for that to be possible, all of our communities need to have access to the things that you need to scale a business, which includes capital, so investment, talent, a supportive ecosystem, supportive regulation, and really importantly, a client base. And that's where open innovation comes in. That we need to make sure that the large buyers who have big budgets to invest in innovation and to invest in technology in London are genuinely looking beyond the usual suspects and are making that opportunity available to entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities so that they can scale their businesses just as everyone else can. And so for me, that's where the inclusion aspect of open innovation is so important. When we were designing the Open Innovation Fellowship, we spoke to lots of entrepreneurs and lots of corporates. And one of the things that we heard very often from people who do kind of innovation scouting roles within corporates, and some might be on this call, was that it often feels like you just meet the same people over and over again. You go to networking events, or you go to hackathons, or you read kind of top lists in, tech magazines. It's almost like Groundhog Day. You just keep seeing the same people over and over again, sometimes with different businesses, but the same people. And there's a sense that actually the London community of ideas and entrepreneurs is much, much bigger and much, much more diverse than that. And the challenge we have is to break down some of these barriers and really expand the networks so that instead of just meeting the usual suspects who are probably backed by some of the more, high profile venture capitalists, that we are meeting the entrepreneurs with the best ideas, regardless of who they are and where they come from. And that's not going to happen on its own. We have to genuinely take proactive steps to make that happen. And that's a big part of the Open Innovation Fellowship.
Thanks very much. It's fascinating to hear you say that, because, London, huge diversity, but it's also about combining diversity with inclusivity so that everyone has an opportunity, and that those that are going up the ladder are not breaking the rungs of those below them, making it impossible for them to follow. And I think this is very important, and it's a very key role for the city to play in this space. Theo, your comments on this as well, and again, coming back to the kind of human centricity and the user-centered approach, which I know sits fundamentally with many of the initiatives that you've been driving.
Yeah, I mean, whilst Laura's speaking, I was sort of thinking about this in a number of ways. I mean, first, technology and innovation needs to be really useful for people, and London's got a fantastic track record in providing civic-facing technology that really benefits Londoners. And one of the chief organisations that affect everyone's daily life that have been promoting that have been Transport for London. Transport for London introduced the Oyster card. I mean, you can go to many cities in the world where there's not a ticketing system even like the Oyster card. And that was in 2003, I think. That was superseded by contactless payment. The fact that Transport for London allowed people to pay for their journeys using contactless payment helps to popularise contactless payment for the country generally. And so we've got this kind of innovation track record that has really benefited Londoners. Transport for London's opening up of data has enabled the proliferation of a vast number of apps, TfL's own Go app, and of course City Mapper, that enable Londoners to travel around the city in the best route suitable for them. So I think building on that rich tradition gives us a real advantage to talk about technology with people. And I say that because in the next 15 years, we're going to see increasing disruption due to technology. Of course, it will be a source of growth and jobs. A report that Digital Catapult did for us on London's advanced tech stack said that we could expect, of course, 5G and future networks, artificial intelligence already here, Internet of Things, and in the future, the potential of quantum computing. And then on the technology service layer, immersive and extended reality, robotics, autonomous vehicles, distributed ledger technologies. And those things, are a source of strength because these specialisms are embedded in our city. And of course, through open innovation, we may well reap the benefits from it. But they'll also be a source of disruption.
Yes.
People will lose their jobs because of these technologies. New jobs will be created, others will lose their jobs. So it's really important that the city has a role in ameliorating and providing opportunities through that disruption. So programs like the Mayor's Digital Talent Programme are aimed specifically at low-income BAME groups and women, all of which are underrepresented in the tech sector, to support cohorts of entrepreneurs and also high-end apprenticeship services for them. Now, just bringing all of these things together, I think in particular, and we look at the Digital Talent Programme, it's been innovative in the sense it's not just gone down the FE route of training people, it's reached out to private providers such as Liberty and others to have new ways of training people and reaching the people that we want to get into the tech sector. We need to think about open innovation in terms of labour market and jobs and skills. We need to apply the same points that I made before about how we bring in co-design, understanding the needs of the user. And we need to start reshaping that sector, which is, of course, now the responsibility of the mayor, in order to provide that really strong talent pipeline so everybody's got an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming back to the point also that Laura, made at the beginning, the nature of work is changing. The new normal will be different, significantly different from the way it was before. Then you add to that this kind of perfect storm of technology. I mean, if you look at me, you can see I'm pretty old now. So that I've lived 40 years through these kind of technological transformations. In fact, nearly 50, I suppose. In the 70s, everything suddenly went online from batch processing, and you could suddenly talk directly to a computer. In the 1980s brought PCs, and it took about a decade for businesses to figure out how to use them. In the 90s, the internet came along, and again, it took about a decade. At the beginning of the 2000s, we went untethered, we were mobile, we could go anywhere. Now, each of those revolutions took about a decade for us to catch up with. But now we have arguably 5 or 6, you mentioned many of them, from blockchain and distributed ledger technologies through to artificial intelligence, machine learning. These are changing fundamentally the nature of work, and they're giving organizations indigestion. But the strength of London, I guess, is that here in London, we have levels of expertise in all of those domains. We have startups and scale-ups that have the capacity to be born with those technologies and introduce their innovations directly into larger organizations, the B2B market, Laura, you described earlier, as part of it too. And so that we can benefit. But it will result in significant structural change to the nature of employment. It will mean significant change to the way we work. And as somebody that I talked to recently described, I think so aptly, when your co-worker is a robot, your boss is an algorithm, and you appeal to the HR department because you think you're being harassed at work, and that's a chatbot. Is that going to be part of the future? And so we have to design the future of work. We have to design that future new workplace experience to make sure that London can be just an amazing place to work. And it's going to draw on all of those different resources that you've described, I think, and programs that are in play to make that happen. So I think London, again, well, I know I'm the chair, but I like to be able to comment a bit too as well, will have a really important impact on how we work, what we do, how we're employed. And I think this is going to, I hope, but with the appropriate intervention, make sure that London continues to lead in the space. If we look at the role of place, place is very important. Laura, earlier on, you described the kind of dense networks that exist in London. I could go back to the scientific revolution and how it happened in about a quarter of a square mile inside London, the city of London. Literally down to a few squares and streets where this knowledge was exchanged and the scientific revolution began, and the instrument makers created all the science that would subsequently fuel the industrial revolution. You can see the same in the coffee shops of the 18th and 19th century, with the transformation of everything from financial services and trading and new supply chain thinking and new models, economic models. So place is really, really important. Would you like to kind of lead off on this topic of place and what makes London such a special space for innovators, and how that space becomes a place for new ventures to scale up and businesses to exploit that?
I think it's a difficult question to answer, Nick, because I can absolutely talk about the role of place in London's success and its growth to date, and you've given us some fantastic examples, and I'll do that. But I think none of us really knows what the role of place is in this new post-COVID world. Yeah. Because in all of the situations you described historically, there was no alternative. There was no virtual alternative to innovation taking place in a physical location. We know that clusters are hugely important for driving innovation and for economic growth. And we also know that the convergence of clusters is often where the most interesting things happen. So if you take London as a city, we know that some of the areas in which London has really excelled are those where we've had two very strong verticals that converge with each other, if you like. So a deep strength in financial services with strength in technology, you get a world-leading fintech sector. But you could say the same about technology and fashion, fash tech and e-commerce, technology and entertainment, gaming, VR, AR. Where London tends to do best is not necessarily in those kind of pure play deep tech verticals, but it's at the intersection of technology and something else that we're good at. So there's definitely a role for place there. Place also matters because it gives you that serendipity of meeting.
Yes.
Place matters, to your point about coffee shops, because you can bump into people at events in coffee shops on the road. It takes a village to grow a company. It's not just the people inside it, it's all the people around it. It takes a village, and you can build those villages in cities. And London has many of those villages. You know, famously, theres villages around what used to be called kind of Silicon Roundabout and Tech City, but there are also increasingly important villages, ecosystem centres in the King's Cross area, in the Knowledge Quarter, around White City, and many others. So that has been very, very important. I think it will continue to be, because I think it's difficult to replicate that serendipity, that coincidence virtually. But the nature of place will undoubtedly change, and the importance of place will undoubtedly change. And that's not all for the bad, because place is also exclusive. A community or a village that's built around physical places inherently excludes anybody who isn't physically there. Whereas virtual communities can be much more open. So I think we're at the very beginning of a big shift in the role of place in innovation and in scaling innovation and in growing companies and in generating economic growth more broadly. But I don't have a good enough crystal ball to tell you where it's going to end up, I'm afraid. But you might have a view on it. I'm sure you have a view on it, Nick.
Well, I have a view that it'll take a vaccine to make a village, and it takes a village to make a scale. So we have a lot depending on on some of the science that obviously is emanating both in Oxford and, of course, in London at Imperial as well. Theo, you've been very involved, and particularly with TfL, of course, in that sense of place, because you've been seeing with the data that TfL has created and the data that you manage as Chief Digital Officer for the city as well. You've been bringing people physically together, I assume, in this space, this kind of serendipitous joining of forces. Have some of the projects you've worked on been helped by the nature of London as a place, and also have been able to exploit services because of London being what it is as a city? Oh, you're on mute, Theo. We need to unmute you.
Yeah, excuse me. One of London's great strengths is its history around data. The recent history, the London Data Store, created in 2010, one of the first of its kind for a major global city, bringing together data that can give real insights into the growth of the city around us. It's primarily been used for planning purposes, but and we're about to publish a live stream, if you like, of all planning data in London, so that there will be an accurate, up-to-date feed of that data available on an open API. And the important thing about that is, and I think actually just sort of talk sort of in a bit of an abstract way about planning data, is that there's so much we can do and we need to do to innovate in that space. Whether, first of all, it's providing the baseline of functional, good quality data, which we're doing, through to the bringing over of technologies that we see in other sectors for the 3D modelling of our city. The ability of a citizen to soon walk down the street, take their phone and see a plot of land and see a virtual building that's proposed there. To lift our 1950s planning system into the 2020s and engage with people, diverse voices around development. And that's so important for London, because there are 40 areas of London designated as opportunity areas that are going to grow over the next 30 years. Some of them are quite big, like the Royal Docks. Some of them have already got planning permission, like Canada Water, Rotherhithe, a site as big as King's Cross. And that new bit of city will contain more technology. It will probably be more of a sensor-rich environment at such a degree that areas that are considered new today, and I keep mentioning King's Cross, but there you go, I'll mention it again, which is King's Cross new, it is considered new by people, will not be new by any means by the standards of these new developments. And so there's a real question for us around open innovation in design and Londoners here. Because one of the challenges around things like smart cities is that baked into the smart city idea is an element of solutionism. Here's a device, service, product that works somewhere else that can scale in your city. Now, I'm not saying everything goes wrong if you do that, but you don't want to rely on that model. What you want to rely on is, what are the needs of your citizen, and how can we design those new bits of city around their needs?
No, I think this is really very key. So if we've got some budding entrepreneurs who are sitting listening to this, we've got corporates that are thinking about spinning out a business from them that can be complementary to their business, but also extend into new markets. Your thoughts here, I guess, would be, we've got data and sources of data that can help you shape your new ideas, see where opportunities lie. We've got sources of data you can train your algorithms on to exploit, to be able to create new types of services. And if you're going to decide where to be, you may not want to go just to King's Cross, but here are all the other spaces and places which might be so relevant. We've got time for one more little topic here. We've covered diversity already a little earlier. I'm going to just pick up that last theme I commented on, but ask you both, how do you think corporates can better engage with London as a place in which to deliver their open innovation activity? So how can the city help? How can we collaborate? Perhaps, Laura, maybe start with you on this one because of the Open Innovation Fellowship as an example of a program.
Thanks, Nick. Well, when we were looking at how we could support open innovation in London, we spoke to dozens of corporates, to really, as well as to lots of startups and entrepreneurs and people in the ecosystem, to really understand what do they think the barriers are and what might actually help. And what we heard was probably not what we expected. What we heard was that the internal barriers are often as important, if not more important, than the external barriers. So yes, partly the challenge is finding the right startup to collaborate with, but actually your internal procurement, project management, processes, sign-offs, budgeting, culture, talent is as much a barrier to open innovation as finding the right external collaborators. We heard that the people who lead innovation in large organizations often feel quite lonely. You're often doing a role that's pretty countercultural. You're often quite a lone voice, or you and your team are a bit of a lone voice in an organization. Now, Theo's nodding because he's one of them, yeah. Where you're sort of surrounded by other people and potentially even sort of senior leaders and board who don't necessarily get it. And you're having to be this constant translator between kind of tech world and tech speak and your internal culture. And we heard a really strong desire from London businesses to do more open innovation, do it better, to be part of a community of peers where they can share these experiences with people who do understand how it feels to be in that situation, and a really strong commitment and desire to make their open innovation more inclusive, to open it up to more diverse entrepreneurs, a real desire to do that. And so we thought, so when we designed the Open Innovation Fellowship, it was really designed to respond to those things. So it's a 4-month program, and it looks at both the internal and the external barriers to open innovation. It's about making open innovation more effective, but also more inclusive. And we recognize that we need to do various different things to achieve that. We need to be able to share global best practice and frameworks and the latest evidence base globally. And that's why we chose to work with you, Nick, and the RCA as global leaders in innovation and design thinking, to really bring that academic rigor to the course. But it's also needed to be very practical. It's about understanding how to navigate innovation in London. Because one of the other things we heard was that London's innovation landscape is very big and it's very complex, and people don't necessarily know who they should be working with, which are the incubators or the accelerators or the investors or the events that are most relevant for me. And so people can get trapped in a sort of small bit of the ecosystem and they just keep seeing the same people. So it's also about really practical, focused networking, so that hopefully the fellows who are all open innovation leaders from corporates leave the program with a really strong personal network that is inclusive and that's relevant to them. So that was why we designed the fellowship. It launches. We're launching our first cohort later this month, and delighted to have business ranging from Transport for London that Theo's mentioned, to Fortnum and Mason, to Sopra Steria, to schools. So it's a really wide range of businesses that are doing the fellowship, and we'll be launching the next round in January. So if there are corporates on this call who are interested in it, please do get in touch with us, or you can read more about it on business.london. But that's by no means the only way that corporates can make a contribution. That's a very specific program that we're launching now. But I think more broadly, there is so much going on in London. There are so many of these programs that Theo's mentioned. I think challenging ourselves to really think about who we're working with, who we're networking with, when we're sourcing ideas externally, where are they coming from? And if anyone would like support in doing that, please do get in touch with us, because we'd be really delighted to help. And I know how much goodwill there is and how much commitment there is in the London business community to do this really well.
That's great, Laura, and thanks for explaining about the new Open Innovation Fellowship program, because that network will only grow as the program continues, and to create these kind of ambassadors. I'm reminded of the comment that never confuse the territory with the map. The territory can be quite complex, the landscape. The map allows you to see where you need to go and how to navigate it. And so I can see that the Open Innovation Fellowship can give people that map, and also a community, not just of guides to help guide people through, but a community of peers to take that journey together and explore other aspects of it. Theo, coming back to you and the kind of capability as Chief Digital Officer that you can reach out to help corporates, and perhaps not just corporates, but the communities exploit the resources and programs that you have.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I've certainly noticed almost immediately when I took up the post 3 years ago is the tremendous amount of goodwill that exists between the tech sector and the objectives set out that we want to set out for London. We know from our discussions with actually corporates as a whole that we have shared interests over making London net zero and tackling the climate change challenge. It's high up on the board agenda, it's high up on citizens' agenda, and also there's a sort of policy ambition and framework around this. And that's manifested itself in really interesting ways. For example, we just were involved with London First, the business representative body, on a really big project about what kinds of data can we share in order to make the city better. And one of the really big confluences of interest here was over sharing data from private sources about the environment and about climate change. So this is data that may not be used by companies, but is certainly stored by it, how those companies can contribute to a greater understanding in our city. So I say the first part, that there's actually a community of interest, certainly around a number of really important city issues. I also think that it's our job at City Hall to identify the points of friction that have always existed between corporates and city government in terms of whether it's doing business or procurement. And one of the things that we've been really focused on over the first 3 years is just fixing that plumbing. London, for example, had no knowledge. Well, the UK has no knowledge of its collective public sector technology estate. You can see the result of that actually with NHS data sharing during COVID. And so we've set about understanding that for London. So we know what our collective technology estate is, and that gives us that begins to give us a sense of direction about what we think our technology mix should be as a city. Should we do more open source stuff like Barcelona does? Should we diversify our pool from the 15 big suppliers who provide 90% of our technology services in our city, as we found out? So by getting those things right, we can then actually have a really I think a more evolved and informed conversation, both with big tech and scale-ups, about what our next steps are. And then obviously we can also challenge our kind of institutional leaders to think about this as actually a core business issue, not just a sort of IT back office issue.
It's interesting that links to a question I've got here from Melanie Flory. what are some of the ways of and thinking needed to ensure that open innovation ensures that valuable but small isolated entrepreneurs don't fall through the open innovation net? You know, when you commented about 15 suppliers and historically that was 90%, how do we do this so that it isn't just the same old, but we reach out to these communities? Again, Laura, you commented before that we're helping about 1,000 small businesses, scale-ups and startups, as well as other ventures that are already well underway. Do you want to comment on that one for Melanie?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So I think a lot of it is about how effective the matchmaking is between corporates and entrepreneurs.
Yes.
Because there is very little point, quite frankly, putting an early stage, say seed stage startup in front of a global multinational. Because even if they liked the idea, that business is extremely unlikely to be able to scale and sell an enterprise solution.
Yes.
It won't get through the due diligence, it won't get through the procurement, it won't get through the security requirements and so on. So if we're working with a large organization that's looking to implement to buy global solutions and solve global problems, they really need to be working with scale-ups that are ready to deploy at that scale. And that's why a lot of our work is actually with scale-ups rather than with early stage startups. There is a really important role for early stage startups in open innovation, but it's probably often a different one. And that's where organizations are, for example, looking to co-create together, to launch new JVs together, or to acquire IP. That's where matchmaking with earlier stage businesses is really important. Yes. But I think it's that horses for courses, isn't it? It's let's understand what we're actually trying to do with open innovation. The matchmaking, or the networking, it needs to be targeted, it needs to be focused, because there's a massive difference between meeting a business that's done a Series A, that's probably got 50 employees, that has patents, that has technology that it's already deployed at small scale, and it's now ready to deploy technology at large scale, to an early stage business that's got a great idea and some early stage tech and needs some opportunities to pilot, do some proof of concept in order to get to the next stage, in order to win that next round of investment. And so I think being discerning when we're making connections is often part of how we can make those connections useful for both sides. And that's really what we try to do with this. But that's also through our work on the fellowship about helping organizations to understand what do I need, and therefore what kinds of companies do I actually need to work with, and where are they? If what I'm looking for is actually really early stage, fantastic ideas and brilliant entrepreneurs, well, I probably need to be working with these kinds of incubators, these kinds of investors, and some of the fantastic university spin-out commercialization divisions that we have in London. Very different to if I'm looking to buy enterprise technology. So I think that would be my sort of answer to that question.
Okay. Theo, if I could turn to you on the next one, which is from Tyler Moorhead, about ensuring that longevity is built into open innovation so that as tech evolves, and we've all seen the consequence of this with technology, but the tech cycle is very sharp, very fast. How can we build it in? Is this about moving to more long-term platforms where new solutions can be built on it? What's your take on how we can build greater longevity into open innovation?
I think the ambition for the city is to move away from our dependence on inflexible technology and move towards a more modular technology base, so that we can respond more adaptively, respond and adapt to user need as it arises, and retire things that we don't need. Now, easier said than done. What that means is actually an entire shift in our capabilities. It means having more people who can create things within city infrastructure, within city government, rather than just manage contracts. But we're starting on that journey, and our ambition is that modularity, to have those building blocks so we can have that flexible tech stack, if you like, for London. Now, this isn't just a public sector challenge. This conversation may well be being had in organisations right across the country, saying, why have we been with this one supplier for the last, 7 years? Why are we signing 10-year contracts? So and I think core to this, in a sense, isn't so much technology, but it's people. It's like, are we able to attract the right teams of people who can design, code, project manage, so we can do things at speed and with the highest level of functionality. So I think that's how things are built to last. And I'd like I think that's got to be our direction of travel, really, in the end, because you get a better service that meets the needs of users if you do that.
Yeah, there was a question that came up earlier, which is about the BAME, local young BAME communities and talented individuals. How do we make sure that we really open up to a broader and more diverse panel, to link that kind of local young BAME community, that kind of 18 to 30-year-old group, because I'm very conscious through a colleague of mine who set up Greenhouse Sports, Mike DiGiorgio, that there are many communities that have kind of miss out and can't get that first foot on the first rung of the ladder to be able to export or get their ideas expressed up the line. Laura, I think this is something that perhaps you're very conscious of, and we should be taking a look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And it starts very early on. So there are lots of programs, and Theo's mentioned some of them, around digital skills and entrepreneurship for young people in London. Once we're looking at entrepreneurs who have started a business, we support entrepreneurs with early stage startups through what we call our business growth program. And we have a very strong focus there on recruiting underrepresented entrepreneurs, whether that's Black and minority ethnic communities, women, or other underrepresented groups, into those programs. And that's really about having deep, long-term trusted links with those communities. It doesn't happen overnight, and we need to invest in it to make it happen, and understand that the needs of different entrepreneurs are also different. So, for example, the traditional route to fundraising is venture capital, but that often requires being able to secure the loan, and it requires sometimes being able to work for free for quite a long period, and that's not a model that's necessarily available to disadvantaged entrepreneurs. So you much more often find them taking a debt route or bootstrapping. So sometimes sort of traditional accelerator programs in the industry are not catering for the needs of entrepreneurs from different or more disadvantaged backgrounds. And that's something that we're really working to try to address. By no means perfect, and we're working with communities to design those programs, but there is a lot more to do. And then later on, once we have businesses that are ready to go out and pitch and collaborate with larger organizations, that's where the fellowship comes in, and having a network of corporates that we know are really committed, that will take a meeting, that will look outside their existing network, that genuinely wants to meet people who've got good ideas and to give them, if you like, the benefit of the doubt. So I think we have to work at every stage of that journey.
Yeah.
There's lots going on, but there's lots more to do.
Well, look, I think it's a great point to end on. Laura and Theo, thank you very much for joining me for the in-session conversation this morning. And I'm going to pass back to Joe, who will explain a little bit more about what can happen next. So thank you, everyone, and back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Laura and Theo. And thanks to our audience today. Thank you, especially our guest speakers, for sharing your thoughts and expertise. If you have any additional questions or would like to connect directly with the executive education team and the speakers, please use the contact information on the slide that you see on the screen. Please do follow us on social media at RCA Short Courses on Twitter and Instagram, and make sure to check our event webpage for upcoming in-session talks and how to register for free. Thank you for your time, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. Wonderful session. Thank you.
Lovely.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Nick.